Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Jared, you are free to start. Mhm.
Great, thank you. Appreciate what. So I'd like to welcome all of you to ATARC's webinar series focusing on strengthening cybersecurity in state and local agencies using Zero Trust. And today we're going to hear from topic experts that will share their strategies in their agencies that can implement and to alleviate the concern of the unknown and make operations much more efficient. So my name is Jared Bishngreb, and I do have the pleasure to moderating today's panel. I'm the Vice President and Head of State and Local and Education here at Rubric. ATARC stands for Advanced Technology Academic Research Center, and is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to accelerate technology and modernize initiatives. And we're going to go through opportunities where there's cross-agency collaboration, on-site interaction, learning, and market research. So I'd like to welcome all of you today, and I'm really excited to have our panelists and all of our guests on. And in this afternoon, we're going to hear from our panelists, and we'll follow with some Q&A, where we'll pop in some additional poll questions and then answer all the questions that you guys have today. So before we begin, I want to encourage the audience to submit questions of your own in the Q&A section of this platform. And we'll also answer those poll questions to ensure that you receive the CPE credits. So now I'm honored and would like to introduce our panelists. And please give a wave as I call your name. So Lester Goodsey, I'd like to start with you, Chief Information Security Officer at Maricopa County in Arizona. So welcome. James Peace, also Chief Information Security Officer with Louisville Metro Government with the state of Kentucky. So welcome. And Andy Hanks, Chief Information Security Officer with the great state of Montana. So welcome all. Really appreciate you guys joining in today. So I'll start with James because you're the first person on my screen. So I'll hit you up with the first question. So ransomware is increasing threat across all sectors, and we've seen how it's used even more so recently in national state cyber attacks. So how can agencies and governments protect their data against ransomware and recover quickly from these types of attacks?
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, by the way. First, I think you have to start at the foundation. The foundational way to give yourself the most protection from ransomware is to invest in a partner that provides immutable backups. And those backups have to be strategic on your part. You have to back up the right things at the right time. They have to be verified. You have to make sure the data is pristine and immutable. And they have to be practiced. You have to restore them. You have to make sure that when you try to restore a critical data center asset that it actually works. And then you build up from there. So you add to that, you combine with a layered defense. You don't go for the one solution fits everything. Don't buy a vendor that says they're a perfect EDR and IPS and CASB and all the other things that are part of a good layered defense. So you build all that up from the bottom, starting from the immutable backups. And then one of the things we key on at Metro is you really have to have your agencies that you support have a plan for doing business without you, because there's no way you can guarantee, even with all the hard work and the investment you put in, that you won't get hit by ransomware. So you have to encourage the agencies to have these manual run plans. Like, how does the 911 center work without phones and without computers? So one of the things that we've really had success with is building those manual run plans with the agencies. We're going to do everything we can. Is what I say to the agency directors, to keep you from getting ransomware, but I want you to be prepared in case I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's typically, it's not the if, it's more of the when and how you be prepared for that. So appreciate that share. Lester, I'll go to you, see if there's anything else that you want to share on that, anything different.
No, I mean, James really hit the nail on the head. I would say ransomware is one of those things, in my opinion, that's about as binary as it gets in information security, because once you're ultimately popped by ransomware, you have two choices, right? You either restore from backups, to James's point, and hopefully you've done all those things that you suggested, or you have to pay the ransom and cross your fingers, right? So none of us want to get to that point. I would also add, I think some of our discussion that we're going to delve into today with regards to zero trust addresses a lot of the ways how ransomware gets in the first place, right? And so if you can really align who should be given access to what resources in your respective environment, in a lot of instances, that mitigates the risk associated with ransomware. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, that's great. And Andy, so I'll turn it off to you. Anything on this question?
Yeah, sure. So, having immutable backups is definitely gives you more options. We look at in Montana offline backups, right? And so the backup solution that we utilize is only connected during a backup process. It goes through multiple different channels. The software that we use actually detects any kind of encryption. So if there is more than a specific number of encryption files that are encrypted in a given amount of time, it will stop that. It will stop the backup. Having backups that go back farther in time is also important. When we look at identifying cyber threat actors in your network, it takes 287 days to identify and contain somebody inside your network on average. So if you want to imagine that on a calendar, if cyber threat actors get inside your network on January 1st, you will not have them contained until October 14th. That's a very long time. So if you're thinking about your backups, how far back do your backups go, right? So immutable backups, you're talking about write once, read many. There's some difficulties that come with that, but definitely having them offline and not mapped to the device is really critical.
Great, appreciate that. Right, Andy, I'm going to stay with you on the next question. So it's been over a year since President Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. How did the federal actions from the EO, trickle down to your level, to the state and local levels within the agencies?
So at the state level, these directives, these EOs and BODs, they're things that we pay attention to. We try to match for scope and impact, anything that comes down from the feds. Obviously, there's state and local resources at the federal level provided by Department of Homeland Security's CISA group agency, and then also the MSISAC. Those are both very valuable resources to state and local governments. For years, we've heard about challenges that state and local governments face from conflicting requirements from different federal agencies. The fact that we are audited by the IRS, then a year later by the SSA, then a year later by the FBI. And we're thinking, hey, why don't you guys all get on the same page? I know that NASCIO and the NGA and other federal organizations, NGOs have been working with OMB at the federal level to try to get them to align their requirements a little bit better. Anything that's an unfunded mandate right now, though, is a challenge for state and local government. There are grant opportunities that have come along in recent years. So we had the CARES Act, we had ARPA, and now we're getting prepared for the IIJA, specifically with the state and local cybersecurity grant program. However, throwing money at a problem without a plan is not the solution. That's just wasting taxpayer money. So I think really what state and local governments need to do is look at these executive orders, look at the binding operational directives that come out of the federal government, what federal agencies are doing, and state and local government should try to match that. And then at the same time, they should try to work with CISA and MSISAC and those other organizations that provide free resources so that they can then spend their money on the other directives that they're trying to match.
Great, appreciate that. Thanks, Andy. Lester, I'll go back to you and hear from what, from Maricopa County and how this affects you guys.
Yeah, I think Andy summarized it pretty well for us at the county level. A little tongue in cheek, but with the executive orders that come out, it does make my job a little bit easier if I can articulate, look, the federal government and the executive departments at the federal level are mandating this. We really should be following suit, and so if they can do it, we certainly should be able to do it. So that's kind of the approach I take. I will say, just having been in the public sector my entire professional career, I do think over the last couple of years, we've seen the most involvement and interaction between the federal government agencies and that of the state and locals. And so that's been really welcome. I think a lot of that was honestly spurred on by the 2020 election cycle, but we're continuing to see that level of engagement. The formation of CISA in particular, I think is probably one of the best things that has occurred at the federal level as it relates to cybersecurity in general. So I think we're headed in the right direction. Andy's 100% right with respect to some of the funding challenges that state and locals still have, but we are seeing momentum along those lines. And Maricopa County is trying to take advantage of that, as well as, I'm sure, state of Kentucky and Montana. So.
Yeah, that's great. James, how about you?
On a SLTT level, the executive order really has no substance, or at least not yet. The trickle down hasn't occurred. It's a great set of general guidelines for federal agencies, for metrics, for policy guidance, for intra-agency communication. But at least in Louisville, Jefferson County, we've not seen any of that directly from the executive order. One thing we have seen, like both my esteemed colleagues brought up, is a lot of these policy actions and metrics and cross communications have started at a state, local, and territorial level. We've started doing some of that stuff in Kentucky already. So it's good to see that the visions are aligned and we're going in the same direction. I imagine that a lot of this will trickle down over time as they get through the initial policy formation and all the guidelines they have to follow. And also to both of their points, the CISA regional and state cybersecurity advisors, excellent resource, and they're absolutely free. Please engage them. If you're lost and don't know where to start, the state CISA advisors are an excellent resource.
It's great to hear. Of all three of you, a couple of things I picked up was, planning is key, and then those partnerships are also just as key, right? And we'll keep learning as this goes and expands and does trickle down to all the right levels. So I appreciate that. All right, Les, I'm going to start with you, and then after this question, we're going to have a poll question from the group out there. So as we're halfway through 2022, which is crazy to think already how fast the year goes and just peels away each day. What have you guys seen as the most critical cybersecurity threats to government agencies that are emerging this year?
So I don't know if my perspective is necessarily representative of SLTT, so I can only speak for myself in Maricopa County. But honestly, the biggest threat we've been seeing is to propagation and the acceleration of mis and disinformation campaigns against our organization. Look, truth of the matter is there's been a lot of research done. The one I continue to reference is a study done by Pew Research that showed that 71% of all people in this country use social media as a source of news. So that, coupled with the fact that trust in government is at an all-time low for as long as it's been measured, if you will, that's kind of a dangerous combination, if you will. And so, and again, I don't think anybody on this call can or hasn't heard about the challenges that Maricopa County has had along those lines, but we're continuing to see that. And so to give you a tangible example, mis and disinformation campaigns are also, and social media in general, are leading to additional challenges like insider threat. So for example, we're in the hiring phase right now of our recorders department for volunteers and part-time staff to help in preparation for the 2022 election cycle. And so my operations team has stumbled across posts in social media, basically encouraging people to apply for those positions to keep tabs and make sure that we're doing our due diligence, which in itself is not a concern, right? But at the same time, now we have to be concerned about insider threat with respect to individuals coming into the organization who maybe have ulterior motives with regards to what it is that they would be doing for the organization. So I personally see mis and disinformation campaigns, primarily in the form of social media, as probably our biggest risk as of right now. In addition to all the other stuff like ransomware, DDoS, nation state attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just one more thing that we have to be concerned about.
Andy, how about you from Montana?
Yeah, I completely agree with Lester, that misinformation campaigns are a challenge. For me at the state level, it's mainly comes into play with election related items. Misinformation campaigns are low tech. They're very easy to do. They pick up really fast. It's like a wildfire. And it's really difficult to put that out once it starts. Some of the ways to combat that, especially when it involves elections, but anything that comes out of government, state or local government, is to really push .gov domains. So telling your citizenry to trust .gov messaging is a really good combat to misinformation, disinformation campaigns as known good sources of information. As far as like what I think the largest threat is right now is supply chain attacks. So most of us in state and local government have challenges enough to just do basic cyber hygiene and to make sure that we're, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, getting the basic fundamental stuff. Like for instance, knowing what your hardware is, knowing what your software is. Those are the top two security controls for a reason. If you don't know what your hardware and software is, you can't protect them. But I so many times go out to local governments, local law enforcement, and they don't know. We find servers in a closet or under a desk. So that's a big challenge. Knowing what those devices are is the very first thing you need to do. If you don't know your devices, don't worry about spinning up an offensive security program. That capability maturity is way down the line for you. So we have these challenges internally, but now we have to worry about our supply chains. And even the most sophisticated information security programs probably don't have very good vendor management functionality and capabilities. So when we look at things like the Colonial Pipeline, right? And when we look at SolarWinds, and then go back to the Target breach. So we rely on our supply chains, and there's a lot of integrations and interfaces between our systems. We really need to know what they're doing. Right now, I'm aware of multiple vendors that are having active ransomware attacks right this very minute. And some of that information is not public knowledge right now. So having those relationships with your vendors, making sure that they have to contractually notify you as soon as they have a suspected cyber threat. Look at your contracts. If those contracts say, we will notify you within 48 hours once we confirmed there was a ransomware attack. Well, their internal confirmation process might take a week, right? Might have to go through multiple levels of approval, might have to go through a legal team. That's not going to be good enough for you. It only takes a minute for a supply chain to become a hack in your organization.
Scary. James, how about from your side?
How am I supposed to follow that? That was excellent.
I'm locking myself up. That's
Now, misinformation, supply chain, I would suggest investing into a platform. I'm gonna name drop here. I don't know if it's allowed, we can edit it out, but BitSide is a good company for third-party vendor management. It's not the only one out there, it's just one we use. But in addition to those two things, we focus a lot on preventable human error, whether it be with our local admins or our employees or people at these vendors that are doing things or making decisions on our behalf. I read somewhere in the last 2 years that human error was involved, preventable error was involved in almost 95% of all cyber attacks. So we tend to focus on controls and processes and policies that minimize preventable human error, but we'll never get rid of it. We try to minimize it. And that's one of the attractive things about Zero Trust. It addresses the fallible human.
All right. I think Alyssa's going to post a poll question out there, so we'll let that come on up. So in your opinion, what's the biggest barrier to protecting against cyber attacks in the SLED environment? So please answer away, and we'll see what those responses are. So I'm going to continue to ask some questions of our panelists, and then we could come back and see what these polls look like, and we'll keep bringing some on. So James, I'm going to go back to you. We'll start with you again. Huge factors in mission success in IT and networking world really revolve around the incident response and remediation before, during, and after the cyber attacks. Going back to what you were saying about being prepared for this. So what are some of the best practices that you can share with a lot of your peers that are out here in the audience today?
This will probably make my esteemed colleagues cringe because none of us probably do it perfectly, but be as proactive as possible in threat hunting and risk identification. When you get into the game of being reactive, milliseconds matter, like Andy was talking about with the vendor supply chain issues. Have playbooks, have run books, have processes that will continually evolve and improve your response time. And always don't be afraid to question them or let a third party question if you're doing the right thing. Always be open to external suggestions on the ways to improve your processes.
That's great. Kind of goes back to that partnership, whether federal or private public partnership. So Andy, I'll turn to you on that question.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes.
Yeah,
absolutely. So really, from the huge factors for mission success in IT and networking really revolve around the incident response, the remediation before, during, and after having that plan. So what are some of the best practices that you guys have used that you want to be able to share out?
First of all, that's a fantastic question. I'm going to just say the very most important thing is to have an incident response plan. If you don't have a plan, you're done. And that plan needs to be exercised in real world scenarios. So running tabletop exercises is a very good way to exercise that plan. What we do at the state level is we run 3 a year, well, at least 3 a year that we have a third party host for us. So we use Department of Homeland Security. They have a strategy and planning team that will come out and run tabletop exercises for you. They'll do scenarios and injects. They'll work with part of your team to come up with those at first. So we do a statewide, which is all public and private entities in the state of Montana can participate. We do one state agency wide, so it's Montana state government tabletop. And then we do our IT division, a tabletop that's specific to us. So exercising that plan, so it's like when you think about backup and recovery, right? So many people do backups, and part of their disaster recovery plan is to test those backups, right? But when you bring those backups up, are you actually seeing if you can write to the file system? Are you seeing if you can retrieve data from the file system? So many times people forget that important part of a disaster recovery planning and testing. With the incident response things, there are services available, free services from CISA, where they will have either a CSA and or a CSA and PSA come out. So a CSA is your cybersecurity analyst. Every state has one. They're also rolling out statewide coordinators now to every state. And then a PSA is a protective service agent or a protective security agent. And then, of course, every state also has at least an INA, which is more intelligence. But CISA will come out and work with your state and local governments to develop your incident response plans. And then they can also come out and help you test them. And one more thing about incident response plans, you need to include your communications people, because communications is going to be key. Know who is authorized to speak and who is not authorized to speak. Have your public information officers part of your incident command. Send your people to incident command training. FEMA has excellent courses for incident command training. Anyone that is an official named member or has a formal role in your incident response must have completed incident command training in the last whatever year, 18 months, 2 years, so that they understand how that works. And then finally, your Department of Emergency Services, your Department of Military Affairs, and your National Guard. They're the pros, they're the experts. Anytime you can work with your National Guard in any kind of incident response, that is who you should be working with. Matter of fact, they should be running the show at that point. They have a lot more statewide capabilities, and they have the expertise now to lead that in statewide response. And they've proven during COVID that they can. Our National Guard were fighting fires, fighting COVID, running cyber incident response. They were doing 20 different. They were also working in hospitals. So they were doing tons of stuff. So use them. They're there for a reason. That's why states have National Guard.
I think that's a big reason why you see James shaking his head there. 30 years at National Guard. So thank you for your service on that. And, in each and every state, I'm here in New Jersey, and, sort of what they were able to do on the front lines of through the pandemic. So thanks for, making sure you do that shout out there. So Andy, appreciate that. Lester, I'll come to you, and then we'll pop up another poll question for everybody.
Yeah, great feedback from everybody. The only couple things I would add, and so my perspective is slightly different because I'm at the county level, right, versus state. So part of our incident response plans also include what our role and under what circumstances do we communicate with our local fusion center, and by extension, our 3-letter agency partners and the state of Arizona in our instance. And so just to add on what Andy was talking about, it's been my experience that a lot of incident response plans don't emphasize the communication aspect enough. And so we talk about, okay, what tools are we going to use? What's those processes, et cetera, et cetera. But what are the communication expectations of your organization? What's the protocol? What's the frequency in which you communicate with your partner agencies or internal to the organization? I've seen in the past those tend to get overlooked, and so when it hits the fan, maybe your response from a technical tools perspective is pretty good, but then your communications protocols are a little bit lacking. I agree with both James and Andy in that you should practice this. It's obviously the first criteria is to have the plan in the first place, but if you never practice it, it's kind of like riding a unicycle. You can do it, but it's not going to be comfortable, right? So you need to definitely practice that. And then the other thing is, the more you practice it, the more opportunities you have to continue to refine and enhance and improve that incident response plan. So those are things that we try to do on a regular basis. We do within my internal operations team. We hold monthly exercises. We've just recently started the process where we're engaging other external departments, or so to Andy's point, in his case, it's other state agencies. In mine, it's elected departments, that have their own IT organization. So we've begun the process of practicing our incident response plan, not only for us, but then to also help those departments better understand where those gaps might exist and what the expectations are in terms of what is my team responsible for from a reporting and a response perspective versus theirs, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I can't begin to tell you, if we hadn't had that preparation and those plans in place over the course of the last 2.5 years, we would have been in a world of hurt. So I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, you said practice is key, right? You talked about that unicycle. I was thinking, a pilot, right? They might know how to fly, but you want to make sure they're practicing all the time. So great. So I think we have, Alyssa, I think we have another poll to pop on up. All right. So poll number 2, where does your agency currently stand in the zero trust architecture implementation? So it's going to be, talking about planning and where you are at. And to be honest, this will be interesting because I truly think everyone's at all different stages, and that's okay. It's just what you're going to start doing come tomorrow on that. So it'll be interested to see those results. So, all right, we're going to start some of the questioning again. and I've lost track who I started with and who I ended with. So, so Lester, I'm going to stay with you. I feel like this is, like Jeopardy, not Jeopardy, but tic-tac-toe or Hollywood Squares or one of those game shows. Probably dating myself. So, if you could just do one thing, what would be the most significant change or action that you could take to strengthen your organization against the cyber attacks?
At the risk of being redundant, and in terms of those references, Jared, apparently we're of similar age because I got every single one of those references. But at the risk of being redundant, Andy hit the nail on the head, which is knowing what's in your environment. How can you measure risk on an enterprise level if you don't know what you have? And just to tie this back to the topic of zero trust, I think a lot of organizations, when they hear about zero trust, they tend to focus on individual identity, right? But zero trust is really a lot more comprehensive than that. It involves service identity, it involves device identity. And so if the concept of zero trust is to only allow who needs access to that resource, if you can't define what that resource is, then you have no hope whatsoever of being able to make it on that journey. But that fundamental understanding of what's in the environment, and I would also encourage everybody on this call to expand the definition of asset, right? Not just like hardware or software, but services, things that are important to your organization that you need to know. And again, from an enterprise risk perspective, you need to have that understanding so you can ascertain where your risk is. From a zero trust perspective, with the premise that identity is the new perimeter, right? That definition of identity extends beyond your username and password, right? It extends to the asset itself, it extends to the service itself. So if you can get your arms around that, that's going to check off so many boxes for any organization and make some material improvements across the board.
Great. James, I'll go over to you.
Yeah, it's sort of in parallel with that. I think if I could give others advice on what was the most significant change you could make to start down the right path, would be to adopt a control framework or a standard or a compliance regulation that you are subject to, or that you think you can ingest, identify the weaknesses against that, and then start moving towards closing those gaps. Also hold your vendors and your partners accountable. I mean, we all the time, we get vendors and partners saying that, well, no one else makes us sign our EXEs, or no one else looks for our hashes and virus total, or simple things like that. But once you adopt this control framework as a standard, hold everybody you do business with accountable to that. I take it as a badge of honor when someone says something like that to me. Well, no one else asks us to do this. Good, we are.
That's great. Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I completely agree with everybody who was just saying it. It's funny, this question, because well, let me tell you, the first thing that I did was I hired a security architect, and I made that position responsible for leading our zero trust journey. And I think that's how zero trust needs to be described. It's not a single person, process, or technology. Anybody that tries to sell you a black box and says, here you go, here's zero trust, run away. It's an incremental process. It's a series of projects. You may never get to exactly where you think you're going to get, but every incremental step is on the way. So my security architect was just in here before this meeting and gave me this this deck here. And what he's got on here on our roadmap is we're going to do PKI consulting. So make sure we got our certs controlled, inventory all physical and virtual hardware and software, something called data applications, assets, and services, DAAS, identify all users, roles, and permissions for applications, create annual procedure for least privilege review, do a third-party zero trust maturity assessment, and begin microsegmentation with critical enterprise assets. So that's what we're doing the first year on our zero trust. And I literally just read this as the other gentlemen were answering the question. So it sounds good to me. So that's what we'll be doing first year.
I love it. I love it. And you know, what's interesting is you look at the poll questions, you do have everyone kind of in different, you know, across the board, right? Different areas on their zero trust journey. And as you all said, right, it's not any one thing. There's no magic bullet to it. There's all different, you know, components to it. So thank you guys. All right, the next question probably really is either similar to what you guys just answered, or maybe we could elaborate a little bit more. And that is around, you know, zero trust. So what are some of the strategies to build an effective protection against ransomware by making that zero trust a strategic priority? And you know, Andy, you know, I'll start with you, because you know, you actually made a role, you know, a role and a responsibility on that role, which is, you know, something that probably not seeing everywhere. And you know, with our attendees on the call, it'll be interesting to see how many, you know, have those. So you know, definitely be curious to see, you know, are there some other strategies that are being built for that? But you're on mute, Andy.
Yeah, so we kind of divided up this. So I started the strategy a few years ago, and I divided up tasks within people, processes, and technology. So with the people, some of the key roles we identified was that security architect, right? But also cloud security. So all of our risk management people are in the process of becoming certified cloud security professionals. It's different skill sets than your classically trained, security people. For us, zero trust is being driven by our governor. He wants more mobile applications for our citizens, have more easy access to state services. He wants more cloud, right? So that we're being cloud smart. We're using cloud where it makes the most sense. So the drive to mobile technology and cloud technology necessitates the move to zero trust. Zero trust is simply just getting rid of your network perimeter. The classic security model is network perimeter based. You don't trust anything outside your network, and you trust everything inside your network. Zero trust is never trust, always verify. You don't trust inside your network, and you don't trust outside of it. So that means that, for instance, things like these insider threats, things like SolarWinds, right? Those are perfect examples of why you need zero trust. So you need to start logging everything internally. You need to start encrypting everything internally. There's no longer a network perimeter. And so shifting from the network perimeter to the data perimeter, where your protections around data, you're continuously authenticating users, devices by application or data store. So the people, you know, that you need the people to do that in this model. The processes, we look at anything that's repeatable and scalable. We look at, Six Sigma, Lean, ESSA. ESSA is eliminate, simplify, standardize, and automate. Looking at all those types of processes, establishing control points and metrics. And then when we talk about technology, you know, layer 7 firewalls, security orchestration, automation, and response technologies, cloud access security brokers, thinking about the technologies that sit between your data and your users. That's where the investment needs to be. But most people, I hear them talk about zero trust, they're talking technology. There's people and processes that are really important too in there. So I tell people not to forget about that.
Great. All right, James, how about same question for you?
So I was sitting here striking through parts of my answer that Andy mentioned. I've got 2 words left. But no, he really hit the nail on the head. You do have to cover all 3 of those aspects of the security program. And the only thing I would add to that is you have to be aware of your own weaknesses, not just the things that you can put in place. You have to know where the weaknesses are in your non-existent perimeter. I mean, I've literally used that phrase multiple times this year. That was excellent.
Lester, anything to add?
Yeah, so along those lines, and just to use Maricopa County as an example, one of the things that I've seen with organizations who want to take a serious bite out of zero trust is they really don't have a good programmatic or operational approach to identity in general. And so Maricopa County was no exception to that. And so in addition to our zero trust journey, we have a formal identity access management strategy underway as well too. And so one of the things I would encourage people on this call to consider is, Andy did a really good job describing the multiple different parts, whether it's technology, whether it's processes or people that are required for to implement an effective zero trust model for any enterprise. And so part of that is recognizing what the bigger picture is at the enterprise level and what's going on from a project perspective. And so a good example of this is Maricopa County is getting pretty close to rolling out a new HRM solution. So we're going with Workday. And so we were able to negotiate because we knew where we wanted to head with zero trust and identity. We are able to coordinate a conversation with the Workday project because in our previous research, we determined that there was no central source of truth for certain identity groups, right? Namely contractors, interns, and volunteers. And so what that meant was departments were managing those identities on an individual basis. So there was no central source of truth. So you can imagine how difficult it would be to eventually implement a zero trust model where you didn't have a single source of truth when it came to certain identity groups, right? And so we were able to negotiate tweaking the scope of the Workday project to address that shortfall. And so I think because of the various different moving parts associated with what is required for zero trust, be cognizant and be mindful of what the organization is attempting to do, what other departments are trying to do, and what impact that may or may not have, or how it could be enhanced by virtue of adopting certain processes that are in support of zero trust, if that makes sense. And so, because oftentimes it's kind of like, it's like doing fiber planning, right? It's the cheapest when the road's dug up, right? The last thing you want to do is dig up the road after you've just paved over it. And so same thing applies from a zero trust perspective. If there's opportunities to kill two birds with one stone and move things along, then definitely I would encourage that you take a step back. Andy's approach was to hire a security architect, which makes all the sense in the world, right? And so I would encourage organizations to take a step back, and regardless who's doing that, kind of look at the bigger picture and try to do things in a smart, efficient manner.
Great. All right. Thanks for sharing, Lester. So Alyssa, would you like to pop up the third poll that we have for the audience? And while that's happening, please make sure that you guys go ahead and enter some questions in the Q&A screen there. So we have a couple more questions for our panelists from me, and then we'll open those up. So, all right, third poll question. In your opinion, how important is digital modernization in furthering cybersecurity in state and local government? So looking forward to seeing those poll results. So this next question I have for you guys, being with Rubrik, it's a little near and dear to my heart. So, what are some of the best, practices for implementing a zero trust architecture that ensures your backups are truly immutable? And I know, some of you touched on that early in one of the early on questions. So, so James, I'll start there with you. I think you were the first one that brought that up.
Yeah. So when I said multi-tiered backup strategy, I've meant both time and detection methods, right? So you want to have multiple layers of immutable backups, but you also want to have multiple opportunities or processes for detection between the device or application and when it becomes an immutable backup. So you want to stagger those on both time and detection methods. And then in addition, I mean, we've all hit on this before, partner with trusted vendors or with CISA, with MSISAC, with your state fusion centers. There are so many good resources out there, and most of them won't cost you a dime. And they can supplement your approach to mitigating risk. CISA, for example, they have free vulnerability scanning. They have free but kind of hard to schedule tabletop exercise. They do free assessments. They do free phishing. And they've got all these great things that won't cost you a dime and can get you closer to a true zero trust status.
All right, great. And by the way, you see the poll results, right? is very important. So great to see that answer. So Lester, I'm going to ask you that same question about the zero trust architecture that ensures your backups are truly immutable.
Yeah, so maybe take a different spin on the response. And so, not that I don't agree, I 100% agree with what's been said along those lines. I think it's also important to kind of test your assumptions with regards to that. And so in our case, we brought in a third party to do a pen test specifically on our backup architecture and ensure that our backups are operating as designed. I think there's some ancillary benefits to doing that besides the obvious, trust but verify, so to speak, that Andy had talked about from a zero trust perspective, applying the same logic to our backup architecture. But we wanted to be able to do that, and there's ancillary benefits. So whenever you're going through your cyber insurance renewal cycle, right, and being able to provide tangible evidence along those lines also kind of helps in an ancillary fashion. But it's one of those things where zero trust is something. The concept has been around for, over a decade, but it's just been rebranded multiple times. But this is something that's a relatively new journey for a lot. So I think having that additional layer, whether it's resources that James mentioned or bringing in a third party to assist, is pretty critical to ensuring what you're doing actually works as intended. So.
All right. And then Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm trying to figure out if I have anything to add to it, actually. I don't think I do. I mean, obviously, so this webinar is hosted by Rubrik. Rubrik's got a great backup solution. We happen to be a customer of Rubrik, and we're very happy with the solution that we have here at the state. We also use other solutions as well, talking about defense in depth. I think that's what's important is though there's great technologies out there and great solutions out there, having a little bit of diversity in that can also help with the resiliency of your backup infrastructure. But really, like we said at the top of this meeting, or top of this webinar, having backups gives you options in ransomware attacks, right? A lot of states right now are passing laws that not only require you to notify state government if there's a ransomware attack or a breach, but also preventing the payment of ransomware. So if you happen to live in a state, I think North Carolina is one of the latest states or the first states to do that. If you live in a state like that, really your only option is to have immutable backups or offline backups that can't be touched. So I think they're very important and critical to part of your ransomware response playbook.
Thank you, and I couldn't agree more. All right, last question I have for you guys. And Andy, I'll stay with you. So what's the biggest challenges to addressing cybersecurity risks that you're seeing?
So right now, so I sort of, as a state CISO, I have quite a bit of responsibility when it comes to cybersecurity. It expands beyond executive branch and state government, which is where most of my authority is. But I have a lot of responsibility in other branches of government and also throughout any public institutions in Montana, and also it's advisory to private businesses as well. So when I look at that whole picture, the biggest challenge is the different levels of capability within organizations. So one of the things I've been working a lot on right now is preparing for the state and local cybersecurity grant that we're expecting to get the notice of funding opportunity for soon. We have people that even in state agencies that don't have any kind of cybersecurity program. We have state agencies that have, a very robust cybersecurity program. Well, they all share the same network. Okay, so if we're investing all of these resources in one state agency, but none in the other, and the one that's not getting any resources is hacked, well, that one that's just invested a whole bunch of resources in cybersecurity, they're out of luck, right? That's all been to waste. So one of the things we're looking at in state right now in Montana is centralizing cybersecurity in state government so that we can take risk-based approaches to cybersecurity decisions and strategy. When we look at local government, Citizens don't care. So, one of the big challenges in government is that we're holding data of our citizens that they didn't ask us to hold, right? So take a social security number. The township will have that social security number. The city will have it, the county will have it, and the state will have it. If I'm spending $1,000 to protect the citizen's social security number, the county is spending $100, the city is spending $10, and the township is spending $1 to protect that same social security number, well, that doesn't make much sense. And the citizen only cares that their social security number was breached, right? They don't care where it was breached because they now have to spend the rest of their life fighting identity theft and fraud. So I think taking statewide approaches, whole of government approaches to cybersecurity is really the only option when it comes to state and local government cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's great. Looking at the big picture is critical. Lester, how about you from a county side?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest risk and one that we are actively trying to address is I think it's a safe statement to say adoption of cloud services was a thing even before the pandemic. What the pandemic did to us and many other government agencies was accelerated the adoption of those cloud services. An example of that is Maricopa County has, and still has, a fair amount of locally hosted applications, some of those built in-house, right? And then over the course of the pandemic, all of a sudden, these departments who had been traditionally reticent about wanting to expose those out to the internet couldn't get them published out to the internet fast enough. And so have the appropriate controls in place. And so I think what a lot of organizations are having challenges with is kind of what James and Andy alluded to earlier in the webinar, which was, the change in perimeter, right? From, with this concept of zero trust. In particular, the network is not the perimeter anymore. And so adoption of cloud services is exacerbating that problem. And in a lot of instances, organizations, not only technology, but processes, workflows, et cetera, are centered around the concept that those services are being provided in-house. And so what I would ask people on the call is to kind of take a step back and ask themselves, do you have, for example, the same visibility in your cloud services as you do with those services on-prem? And if the answer is no, okay, then what are you doing to address that, right? I would also argue that there might be more challenges with adopting a zero trust framework for cloud-based services as opposed to on-prem. And so I think those are all challenges. That's the logical direction that we're all headed. And we need to, if organizations haven't accepted that already, they do, right? And so how do we ensure that we have the right insight and security controls in place? So regardless whether that service is being hosted internally, a private cloud or a public third-party cloud, that we still have those proper controls in place.
Great. Thank you, Lester. James, how about from your side?
So it's apparent by the answers of the panelists today that none of us experience this now, but I bet we all have experienced it in the past, and some of the attendees might be experienced the lack of executive buy-in. I found personal success myself at Metro and in the military of addressing people as individuals, not as directors of HR or directors of finance, or approaching them on a person-to-person level, not just the CISO that sits in his office telling everybody no for the applications they want. Go out and have coffee with someone, talk to them on a personal level, talk to them about risk, and that will lead to a better executive buy-in. That's not as eloquent an answer as the other two panelists, but that's one of the things I wanted to key on. Just be a person that wants to relay what the risk is to other people, not just title to title.
All right. Perfect. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. That's the end of the questions I have. That'll probably maybe some of the hard ones coming from the audience. So I know we got one last poll question. I think this is going to be definitely a simple one. So I'll let Alyssa get that posted. So we do have a couple other questions in the chat, the Q&A area. So if there's any others that come on in, we'll ask it. So, all right. So the poll question, real simple. Would you like to receive CEP credit for today's event? So yes or no. So we'll let you guys answer that up. All right. So so from the questions, I'm just going to open this up. So James, Lester, Andy, whichever one of you guys want to chime in and answer it. And if the questions aren't clear, we can always ask back. I know we have just a few more minutes left. So the first one, and this might have been a question from something that was shared earlier, but how is the cache and the memory restore done? I think that might have been maybe off of the topic. So not, we could come back to that and see if we get some clarification on that question. So, all right, let's do that. We'll get some clarification. All right, next question was how to best protect your backups from possible infestation already in your system or files that you backed up from a ransomware attack. That's a great question.
So I'll jump in, although I can't remember whether it was Andy or James who responded to this. I think the duration and the frequency in which those backups are done is the way to address that. And so I think it was Andy who said that some of the technology he was using looked for evidence of massive encryption, right, which would be an indicator of ransomware, also impacting your backups, right? So if you have that technology coupled with your backups going far enough back, and then B, doing it in an incremental enough fashion that meets your organizational needs, that's, in my opinion, that's kind of the best way to address that, short of all. And obviously the other component would be a multi-tiered backup approach, so you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. But again, that kind of goes back to what is it backing up, and is the juice worth the squeeze in terms of having to maintain multiple backup infrastructure in place. So if your data is sensitive enough and it's critical enough, then maybe you can make that business case. Otherwise, maybe it's a risk that you accept. So just throwing it out there.
Yeah, and even from my side, being on the other side, to kind of answer that a little bit, right? It's ultimately it's making sure that we build a quarantine, around that infestation, right? So how do you really build a fence around it, mitigate any of that going into the rest of the data, and then to what really everyone shared, it's making sure that you do have those clean backups, because a ransomware attack, even and we talk about in the last states don't allow for paying of those ransom. You might get a key back. You might be able to restore, but there might be something down the road that might be infected and could come back in 6 months, a year. And we've definitely seen that, across the country. So, all right, we'll go to the next question here. Do you think some state or local governments also fall under the cybersecurity poverty line, the term used at the cybersecurity conference?
I think that's definitely a problem at some of the smaller municipalities and cities. And if it's a problem at Louisville, Jefferson County, and Maricopa County in the state of Montana, then that's an executive buy-in issue, because if you've watched the news anytime over the last 10 years, you know what these things are. I think one thing we should all revisit is that, like Andy, we have responsibility for a certain enterprise, but our reach extends beyond that enterprise to the same patch of ground that we all occupy. For example, in Louisville, there's 17 municipalities that aren't part of our enterprise, but it's in our best interest to help them protect themselves, because if they get popped, it's going to lead to us getting popped.
That's great. Appreciate that, James. Well, we are at time. I want to be respectful of our panelists. Really, for the time here today, James and Lester and Andy, really enjoyed getting to speak to you guys virtually. And looking forward to getting more of these in-person things. But it was great getting to hear from each and every one of you what that journey has been, where you are on that journey, the challenges and things that you're facing. And really excited that all of our attendees got to take some tidbits and take that back to their organization. So thank you all, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.